Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel and today we're doing some Halloween DIYs. For this first project, we're going to grab two of these little skull tea light candle holders that I got from Dollar Tree last year, and I just decided to glue these together, so I'm using some gel super glue to attach one to the top of the other one. While that glue is drying, I'm going to grab one of these wood rounds from Dollar Tree to make a base for this because it is a little top heavy. I also grabbed some of these Spiderweb napkins from Joann's, and I'm going to Mod Podge that on top of the wood piece. But before I do that, I did paint that wood piece black with some of my chalk paint, and I also painted the skull candle holders black as well. Once the wood piece was dry, I grabbed that spiderweb napkin and I'm going to pull it apart and just use the top piece for this. I grabbed some Mod Podge and I'm just doing a really light layer over the top of this before grabbing my napkin and smoothing it out over top of there. Once I get the napkin all smoothed out, I will trim off most of the excess around here, and then I'm going to add a layer of Mod Podge over top of this. I let that Mod Podge completely dry and then just worked around it with my sanding block to get off all those edge pieces. I wanted to add another piece of the napkin around the edges, so I added a little bit of Mod Podge, cut down a piece, and then just wrapped it around my wood piece, and again covered it with another layer of Mod Podge, let that completely dry, and then sanded off the edges. Then I just used some more of that gel super glue to glue my little skull down to this base. And to finish this off, I just grabbed some of my European gold rub and buff and went over all the little details on these skulls. For this project, I grabbed one of these wood sign plaques from the Dollar Tree Plus section, and I'm going to start out with a wet paintbrush and use some of my black chalk paint, and I'm going to go over the sign really messily with this black paint. You'll want to keep this paint thinned down and also leave some of that wood showing through, because then I'm going to go back in with a wet rag and some of my antiquing wax, and I'm going to go over this entire sign, including where I painted the black, but making sure that I am definitely getting all the wood showing through. And it's going to leave you with this really distressed, almost burnt looking wood sign. I went into Photoshop and created my own little sign here that says Sleepy Hollows, Headless Horseman, Bed and Breakfast, come lay your weary head. So I just traced it out of my computer. Now, unfortunately, I did make it a little too big for my sign, but I will fix that in just a little bit. For now, I'm grabbing some of my carbon paper and I'm going to start using my little tool that came with my carbon paper and just trace over that top portion. Then here is where I'm going to kind of fix it a little bit since it was too big. I did have to raise my sign up a little bit and then tape it back down to kind of fill in that little space in between the top and where it says Headless Horseman. So once I had that tape back down, then I just went ahead and went over that entire thing. Now, I wasn't able to fit that little bottom part down there just yet, but again, I will fix that in just a little bit. I went in over top of where my carbon paper left my sign on here with some of my white paint markers, and I just traced over those lines and then filled in all my little letters. Now, I know it's hard to see the carbon paper on this black sign, but it is easy to see on here. And as you can see, I did put the bed and breakfast at the bottom, but I did sand that off in just a little bit. Right here, you can see it sanded off because I needed to make it a little smaller. But before I fix everything that I messed up on here, I did go in with some of my chalk paint in the color plaster and I filled in that moon. And after this dries completely, then I will go back in with some more carbon paper paper and add back on the Headless Horseman. I also watered down a little bit of yellow paint and just kind of blended it in with that plaster color while that color was still wet. Then after everything was dry, I'm going to go in and try to fit in those words that I wasn't able to fit since I did make this sign a little too big for my wood piece. So I ended up putting "Come Lay Your Weary Head" on the left-hand side and "Established in 1640" on the right-hand side. Again, I just used my paint markers to go over those, and then to finish it off on the bottom there, I added back in that bed and breakfast. I also cut out the piece that had the Headless Horseman on it and used some more of my carbon paper to trace over that, and then I outlined him with a marker but ended up using a really small brush and some of my black chalk paint to fill him in. And to finish the sign off, I just mixed up a rusty orange color, filled the jack-o'-lantern in, and added some eyes and a mouth. For this next project, I grabbed one of these little pumpkin jars from Dollar Tree last year, and I also grabbed my dry erase marker and I just drew a spider web on here. The reason I used a dry erase marker was, as you can see, I made a few mistakes and you can just easily wipe it off if you do. Once I had it drawn on there, then I'm going to grab my hot glue gun and I'm very carefully going to try to go over these lines and keep them as straight as possible. But it is a spider web, so it's okay if it's a little wiggly. If you do have any strands or mistakes on here, you can just peel those off whenever it is completely dry. You'll definitely want to let that completely dry and cool down, and then I went in with 2 coats of my black chalk paint over this entire thing, and I just kind of dabbed it down into where that hot glue spider web was so that I could get the paint down in there. To finish this little vase jar off, I'm actually just using this little sponge tool that came with my rub and buff from Amazon, and I am just carefully going over that spider web and trying not to get it on any of the jar. The only part of the jar I used it on was just tipping the top of it. For this final project, I grabbed a thrift store book. You can use a Dollar Tree book or a book you already have for this project. You'll also need a piece of glass. I'm just using an 8x10 piece out of a picture frame. And then I also just hand drew a spine and some ribs. You can, of course, trace this out if you need to. I'm just going to start by laying that piece of glass over my spine and my ribs, and then I'm going to take my hot glue gun and I'm carefully gonna trace out over top of this onto the glass. Once I have the entire thing done, then I'm gonna go back in and fill all the rib pieces in with some hot glue. You don't have to worry about filling in the spine part, but I do recommend using a cheaper or maybe Dollar Tree hot glue sticks for this because you do use quite a few. Now you'll wanna let this completely dry and cool down, and then you should be able to just peel this up from the glass. It is a little sticky and a little tricky to do, and I did end up breaking a few pieces of my hot glue on my spine, but don't worry about it because you can always just glue those back down when we put this on the book. But once I had it all peeled up, then I am going to line this up on my book, making sure that the skeleton spine is lined up with the spine of my book. And then I'm going to start by hot gluing the bottom piece of the spine and the top piece of the spine, just so that I can keep it where I want it as I start gluing down the rib pieces for the skeleton. And as I'm gluing those rib pieces, then I'm going to go back and glue those broken spine pieces to the spine of the book as I'm working my way down. Then I just repeated gluing that down to the front side of the book. And I am just using hot glue to glue all this down to the book because hot glue sticks to hot glue the best. But once I had it all glued down, then I just kind of went back in, and any little holes that I saw, I filled those in with my hot glue. Then I wanted to add some vertebrae to the spine of this, so I went back over those first lines with a little bit of hot glue, and then I'm just going to make a straight line all the way from the bottom of the book to the top of the book to make those vertebrae. Then I'm going to cover this book to make it extra textured and creepy, and also blend in that skeleton to this book. I'm using some tacky glue. You can use Mod Podge if you want to, but I find that the tacky glue gives a lot more texture. It's a little thicker. You can also work with it for a little longer because it takes longer to dry, and I found it helps so that my napkin is not going to rip when I put it on here. I did use a paintbrush to kind of dab it in between those ribs. Then, like I said, I'm going to just add one layer of a napkin onto here, kind of stretch it out, and then I will start pushing it down in between those ribs to start with. Then I'm just going to push it down all over my book, and you can see there's definitely wrinkles, there's definitely texture, and that's what we want for this book. But as you're pressing this napkin down on here, just make sure that you are definitely pushing it down in between all those ribs and around the outside of the ribs as well. Then I moved on to the spine of the book, and again, I'm using that tacky glue, and I just put a little bit in between where we made those vertebrae, and then I'm gonna pull my napkin over the book, and again, just pressing down, making sure I'm getting this napkin down into all that detail. Then, because I didn't have enough napkin to go over the other side of my book, I just kind of trimmed off a lot of the excess on there, and I'm gonna go in with some tacky glue, push that down onto my book, and then I'll grab another piece of napkin and do the same exact thing. I let the book completely dry, and then I went back in and just kind of trimmed off most of the excess. I did leave a little bit hanging off, and I am going to go in with some Mod Podge now and just add some Mod Podge to the inside of the book and press this napkin up inside of there to make all the edges and ends of the book nice and neat. Then I set it aside to let it completely dry. To embellish my book a little bit more, I grabbed this little keyhole clay mold that I got from Amazon with some of my air dry clay and just made a little keyhole to go on my book. I used some gel super glue to attach it to the front, and then I'm going to go in and do 2 coats of my black chalk paint all over this book. Once that was dry, to finish this off, of course, I'm going in with some of my rub and buff, and I did my little keyhole and all of the spine and the ribs. And then with what was left over on my brush, I just kind of brushed it all over my book. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed these spooky Halloween DIYs. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.